Welcome to Class 10 History Chapter 2 Nationalism in India. We have already learned about what is nationalism and how, when and where nationalism emerged. The feeling of nationalism was different in each country. The First World War broke out in Europe, which had far-reaching consequences in the entire world. This war ignited the spirit of nationalism in India due to the emergence of Satyagraha and non-cooperation movement. This chapter talks about how nationalism captured the imagination of the people in India. It also tells about how the Congress sought to develop the national movement and how different social groups participated in the movement. In India, as in Vietnam and many other colonies, the growth of nationalism is intimately connected to the anti-colonial movement. So in this chapter, we will learn about the anti-colonial movement in India. Why the growth of nationalism in the colonies is linked to an anti-colonial movement? It is because imperialism and colonialism led to increased competition among European powers over trade and colonies. Imperialism is when a country is involved in creating an empire and expanding the borders in order to project its power. It is just about exerting control over the conquered regions either through direct governance or through indirect control mechanisms. The scramble for Africa in the 19th century and the Chinese domination of Vietnam until AD 1983 are examples of imperialism. Colonialism is when one country physically exerts its domination either through a combination of war and diplomacy over another country with a view to exploiting its resources. Takeover of India, Australia, Southern and Central Africa by the British and Western and North Africa by the French are examples of colonialism. They dominated the continents of Asia and Africa. People began discovering their unity in the process of their struggle with colonialism. The sense of being oppressed under colonialism provided a shared bond that tied different groups together. But each group felt the colonialism differently and their notions of freedom were not always the same. Thus, the growth of nationalism in the colonies is linked to anti-colonial movement. In an earlier class, you have read about the growth of nationalism up to the first decade of 20th century. Now we will explore how the Congress sought to develop the national movement. The First World War, KHILAFAT and non-cooperation movement. First, we will look into how the First World War helped in the growth of the national movement in India. First World War created a new economic and political situation. It led to a huge increase in defense expenditure. Defense expenditure refers to the amount that a country spends on military measures or resources. To finance the defense expenditure, customs duties were raised and income tax were introduced. This led to a very difficult life for the people of India. Villages were called upon to supply soldiers and forced recruitment was introduced. This caused widespread anger among the Indians. Through the war years, crops failed in many parts of India, which resulted in acute shortage of food. Also, there was an influenza epidemic. People hoped that their hardships would end after the war, but that did not happen. Thus, people united under leaders to find a new way of struggle called Satyagraha. Now we move on to the idea of Satyagraha. In January 1915, Mahatma Gandhi returned to India from South Africa. He started Satyagraha movement to fight against the British imperial power in India. Satyagraha emphasized the power of truth. It suggested that if the cause was true, if the struggle was against injustice, a Satyagrahi could win the battle through non-violence without seeking vengeance or being aggressive. This could be done by appealing to the conscience of the oppressor. Mahatma Gandhi believed that this dharma of non-violence could unite Indians. He successfully organized a Satyagraha movement in South Africa against racism. In India, Gandhiji had already led Satyagraha movement in various places like Champaran in Bihar, Kheda districts of Gujarat and Ahmedabad to support the peasants. He followed the same method to oppose the Rowlatt Act. Let us see the Rowlatt Act. Rowlatt Act was passed in March 1919 by the British Imperial Legislative Council. The Rowlatt Act gave the British government enormous power to repress political activities in India. It allowed detention and arrest of any person without any trial for 2 years. This was an unjust and oppressive law for Indians. Though it was completely opposed by Indian members, the act was hurriedly passed through the Imperial Legislative Council. So Indians were outraged by the Rowlatt Act, and Gandhiji decided to launch a nationwide Satyagraha against the proposed Rowlatt Act. On April 10th, police in Amritsar fired on a peaceful procession. This provoked widespread attacks on banks, post offices, and railway stations. Martial law was imposed and General Dyer took command. Martial law means direct military control of normal civil functions or suspension of civil law by a government. Nationwide protests were organized by the national leaders and many furious incidents took place. Now we shall look at the JALIANWALA BAGH incident. On 13th April 1919, the famous JALIANWALA BAGH incident took place. JALIANWALA BAGH was an enclosed ground. A large crowd was gathered here. Among them, some were present to protest against the British government's new repressive measures. Some others were there to attend the annual Baisakhi fair. See, this happened in Punjab. Baisakhi is a historical and religious festival of Punjab. Being from outside the city, many villagers were unaware of the martial law that had been imposed. Suddenly, British military officer General Dyer came, blocked the exit points from the ground where people had gathered, and opened fire upon the innocent people gathered there. Hundreds of people, including women and children, were killed and wounded due to firing by the British soldiers. People became furious on this incident and went on strikes and clashes with police and attacks on government buildings. The government responded to it with brutal repression. Seeing violence spread, Mahatma Gandhi called off the Satyagraha movement. Satyagraha had been a widespread movement, but it was limited mostly to cities and towns. Mahatma Gandhi now felt the need to organize a unified national movement that bringing Hindus and Muslims closer together. So he felt to take up the Khilafat issue. Khilafat movement. What was Khilafat issue? The First World War had ended with the defeat of Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire was one of the mightiest dynasties in world history. This Islamic-run superpower ruled large areas of the Middle East, Eastern Europe and North Africa for more than 600 years. Khalifa was the spiritual and political head of the Islamic world. The Ottoman army entered in the First World War in 1914 on the side of the Central Powers including Germany and Austria-Hungary. But they were defeated in the war. There were rumors that a harsh peace treaty was going to be imposed on Khalifa. In March 1919, Khilafat Committee was formed in Bombay to defend the powers of Khalifa. Khilafat movement was led by two brothers, Shaukat Ali and Muhammad Ali. They were also called as Ali brothers. Gandhiji saw this as an opportunity to bring Muslims under a unified national movement. So he convinced the Congress to join hands with the Khilafat movement and start a non-cooperation campaign for Swaraj or Swatantra Bharat. Now let us move on to the non-cooperation movement. Cooperate means to act or work together. Mahatma Gandhi believed that the British rule in India was established with cooperation of Indians. So, if Indians refused to cooperate, British rule in India would collapse and India would get Swaraj or complete freedom. Non-cooperation movement was proposed to begin with the surrender of titles that British government awarded to Indian civilians, a boycott of civil services and give up foreign goods. As they joined hands with Khilafat movement, the non-cooperation Khilafat movement began in January 1921. Now we will discuss the various social groups that participated in this movement and why they joined the non-cooperation movement. Non-cooperation movement started with middle class participation in cities. Students, teachers, headmasters and lawyers left government-controlled institutions, schools, jobs and colleges. Lawyers gave up their legal practices and joined the movement. In other words, they refused to cooperate with the British government. Textile merchants and traders refused to trade in foreign goods. Council elections were boycotted. Foreign goods were boycotted. Liquor shops were picketed. The middle class, especially Indian textile merchants, joined the movement because the boycott of foreign goods would make the sale of their Indian textile and handlooms go up. But later, this movement slowed down among the teachers, students and textile merchants because there were less Indian institutions for students and teachers to choose. And for merchants, handloom clothes were expensive. So they went back to government schools and lawyers joined back the government courts. From the cities, the non-cooperation movement spread to the countryside also. Now we shall look at the rebellion in the countryside. Peasants and tribals took over the struggle in the villages, which turned violent gradually. Peasants' movement in Awadh and Swaraj struggles in the plantations are examples for this. First, we will look into the peasants' movements in Awadh. In Awadh, the peasants were led by Baba Ramchandra, a sannyasi who had earlier been to Fiji as a forced laborer. He led the movement against landlords and talukdars because they demanded high rent and a variety of taxes from the peasants. Peasants had to do a compulsory labor without payment. Such forced labor was called as BAGH. In June 1920, Jawaharlal Nehru started going around the villages in Awadh to understand their grievances. The Awadh Kisan Sabha was set up, headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, Baba Ramchandra and few others. The peasants joined in the movement because they expected that they would be saved from the oppressive landlords and high taxes taken by the colonial government. The peasant movement was spread within a month, and the houses of talukdars and merchants were attacked and bazaars were looted. Now let us focus on the movement organized among the hill people of Andhra Pradesh. Movement of tribals in Andhra Pradesh. It was guerrilla warfare organized by the tribals in Andhra Pradesh. Guerrilla movement means surprise attacks. The enemy has no idea of what is happening until the guerrilla attack is underway. In the early 1920s, a militant guerrilla movement started spreading in the Gudam hills of Andhra Pradesh because the government started closing down forest areas. This affected the livelihood of the people over there. Alluri Sitaramaraju claimed that he had a variety of special powers and led the hill people. He was inspired by Gandhiji and his non-cooperation movement. He persuaded people to wear khadi and boycott foreign goods. The Gudam rebels attacked police stations and attempted to kill British officials. Finally, Raju was captured and executed in 1924. Next comes Swaraj in the plantations. How was the Swaraj in the plantations? Under the Inland Immigration Act of 1859, plantation workers were not permitted to leave the tea gardens without permission. For these workers in Assam, freedom meant the right to move freely in and out the plantations and retaining a link with their own village. When they heard of the non-cooperation movement, thousands of workers left the plantations and headed home. Their understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and the notion of Swaraj was different. They believed that Gandhi Raj was coming and everyone would be given land in their own village. These are the different social groups which joined the non-cooperation movement of 1921. The important thing is that the idea of Swaraj was different for different social groups. The middle class textile merchants joined non-cooperation movement as they wanted to make the sale of Indian textile go up. The peasants took part in the movement as they wanted to be saved from the oppressive landlords and the high taxes taken by the colonial government. The plantation workers took part in the agitation, hoping they would get the right to move freely in and outside the plantations and get land in their own villages. Next comes civil disobedience movement.